Welcome to the deep dive. If you've ever looked out at your garden after a big storm, seen the chaos, pots knocked over, maybe some new plants snapped, then you definitely know wind is a huge force out there. But today, we're actually zooming past just the obvious damage. We're diving deep into the surprising, almost contradictory ways wind affects plants, right down to the material science people use to keep them standing upright.
Yeah, that's right. We've got some really interesting notes here focusing on essentially resilience through engineering. It's about looking beyond just, oh no, the wind blew my plant over. We want to understand the actual mechanics, environmental forces, the choices of materials, and the practical fixes. So our mission for you today is really to unpack that shift. The shift from a plant's, let's say, cheap starting setup from the nursery to a deliberately strong, stable system. And we'll use a great case study, a cassava plant.
Oh, I like having a specific example. This cassava plant that's mu shu in Chinese or ubi kayu in Malay, right? The notes say it was seen getting properly yanked about by a strong gust pull hard from left to right. That kind of sudden, fast wind is definitely chaotic.
Yeah.
But the sources say straight away it's got two sides to it. What are the main effects they observe that show wind isn't just bad news?
Well, on the negative side, yeah, you see the classic disruption. Wind is brilliant at spreading things you don't want, like weed seeds crossing fences. And of course, it's got the raw power to just knock over any flower pot that isn't properly weighted or secured. That's the obvious stuff.
So the visible mess.
Yeah.
But the bit that really jumped out at me was the third effect. That the exact same stress that tips a pot over can actually boost the hardiness of seedlings. It feels wrong, doesn't it? We think wind equals destruction, but here it is acting like some kind of, mandatory boot camp for plants.
It does seem counterintuitive, but it's fundamentally crucial for understanding plant growth. When that gust hits the cassava, or any young plant really, it's doing more than just rustling leaves. It's physically stressing the plant cells. That constant pulling and bending triggers the plant to adapt, basically. It starts putting more energy, more resources into building tougher structures, thicker stems, stronger roots. Botanists actually study this mechanism quite a bit.
Huh. Okay, so wind is like a personal trainer, forcing the plant to bulk up. So why don't we just, stick all our new plants in front of a fan?
Right.
Why is that initial windy phase often so damaging, especially for a plant you've just bought, like that cassava?
That's where the garden center economics bump up against, material science weaknesses. The problem, the vulnerability, often comes down to what the plant is potted in when you buy it. Nurseries aim for, high volume, low cost, so they tend to use very specific kinds of potting media.
And that material, the notes specify, is very often cocopeat. Okay, so for anyone listening who isn't familiar, What is cocopeat and why is it the sort of default cheap option for big nurseries?
Cocopeat is basically processed coconut husk fiber. It's a byproduct, really,
Okay.
but it's readily available, it's biodegradable, and crucially, it's very, very cheap. Plus, it holds water really well and gives roots a nice, airy, sterile place to grow fast, which is perfect if you're trying to grow lots of plants quickly for sale and shipping.
Okay, lightweight. That sounds like the key word there. That word transforms it from just being an economical choice into being a real risk factor when that strong gust hits our poor cassava plant?
Exactly. Precisely. The fibers hold water well, yes, but they offer almost zero weight, no real anchoring ability. So when the wind catches the leaves and stem, creating leverage, that whole light block of cocopeat can just tilt, or sometimes the whole root ball just lifts right out of the pot. So the very thing chosen for affordability, its lightness, directly increases the plant's risk in windy conditions. It can lead straight to, failure.
Right, structural failure.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what you don't want, especially for something like cassava. Doesn't cassava get quite a big, heavy root system eventually? It really needs a solid start.
Okay, so if the cheap stuff, the cocopeat, is a problem, the notes lay out a very specific fix, a 4-step engineering solution to deal with the wind risk. This sounds like more than just basic repotting. It's described as a stability strategy.
It really is. It's a conscious move towards adding artificial density, adding structural resistance. The main goal is just to get significantly more mass down low in the pot while still keeping the soil environment healthy for the roots.
Right. And step one for this vulnerable cassava is pretty straightforward. Put it in a bigger pot. That gives more space, more potential weight right away.
Right.
But the important bit starts with what's already there, the existing soil. Step 2 is managing that light cocopeat. You don't just want to shake it all off. That could shock the roots badly. Instead, the idea is to gently loosen some of it. break it up a bit around the edges of the root ball. You're basically digging out some space, making room for something heavier without totally disturbing the core root system. Strategic removal, you could say.
Creating a void. Okay, then step 3. Fill that void you just made, the space around the roots, using standard potting mix. How does that fundamentally change the stability compared to the cocopeat you just loosened up?
Well, standard potting mix usually has much denser ingredients, actual soil, compost, maybe some sand or grit, heavier stuff. Just swapping out some of the light cocopeat for this heavier mix immediately increases the overall density and therefore the weight of the pot's contents dramatically. You're lowering the center of gravity right away, anchoring the plant better in that bigger container. It's like trying to push over a bag of feathers versus a bag of cement. Big difference.
That makes total sense for adding weight. But the notes really emphasize a 4th step, which feels quite sophisticated. It involves the very top layer, covering the surface with Leca balls. Now, I've seen Leca used for drainage or decoration, but this sounds like it's doing more here. What exactly are Leca balls doing in this windproofing plan?
Yeah, this is where it gets into some neat material science, actually. Leca isn't just decorative gravel. It stands for lightweight expanded clay aggregate. Think tiny clay balls baked super hot until they puff up, full of air pockets inside, but with a hard outer shell. And here, they serve a really critical dual purpose.
Okay, let's talk stability first. How do clay balls on top help stop wind blowing the plant over?
Okay, so when you put a thick layer on the surface, a couple of things happen. First, yes, they add some extra weight right at the top, which helps stabilize the soil right where the stem emerges. That's the critical pivot point for wind leverage. But second, and maybe more importantly, because they're round and rough, they kind of interlock. They form this relatively heavy yet slightly flexible sort of crust over the soil surface. This crust physically stops the main root ball from shifting or rocking back and forth inside the pot when those strong gusts hit it. It dampens the movement.
Ah, okay, so that's like a weighted blanket that also locks together. That's clever. And what about the other function? You said dual purpose. Moisture retention, how did that work?
Well, remember those air pockets inside? They make the Leca balls porous, like tiny sponges. They absorb water from the potting mix below them, which stops the very top surface from drying out too fast in the sun and wind. Then they slowly release that moisture back down as the soil dries, so it helps keep that crucial top layer, which we've now made heavy and stable, from becoming bone dry, which could stress the plant, especially after its roots were just disturbed during repotting. It's a neat system. They tackle the wind stress mechanically and help manage the moisture microclimate right there at the surface.
Wow. It's really interesting to follow the journey of that cassava plant then.
Yeah.
It starts out in this super efficient, low-cost medium, the cocopeat, designed for nursery production. Then it gets moved into this environment that's been intentionally engineered using a whole system. The bigger pot, the denser mix, those stabilizing Leca balls on top. It's a complete shift in strategy, isn't it? From just cheap and cheerful to a wind-resistant fortress.
Absolutely. And that conscious pivot, that's the real takeaway, I think, for any gardener dealing with windy spots. It's about realizing that the affordability of some nursery materials might come with a hidden cost, that environmental risk. And fixing it often requires deliberately thinking about the materials you use, about their physical properties. Garden success, in many cases, isn't just luck. It can come down to understanding the mechanics of what's in the pot.
Totally agree. We've seen that wind is this double agent, really. It can harden plants, build resilience, but it's also this destructive force that creates utter chaos. And for a vulnerable plant, like our cassava example, its immediate survival seems to depend less on its own biology, maybe, and more on whether someone made an intentional choice to use stabilizing materials, like that denser mix in Leca, versus just sticking with the default lightweight cocopeat.
Yeah, the notes really show that focusing on density, on stability, especially right there at the soil surface, it fundamentally changes how that plant experiences wind. It kind of elevates gardening from just, watering and feeding into something more like applied engineering, doesn't it?
It really does. Which brings us to a final thought, maybe something for you to chew on next time the wind starts howling. We heard that wind actually increases seedling hardiness, right? It forces the stem to get stronger.
Yeah.
So if we go to great lengths to protect a plant from wind damage using these robust methods, heavy pots, Leca balls, the whole works, does that intense protection actually prevent the plant from developing its own natural long-term resilience by shielding it from the necessary stress? Or is preventing that immediate catastrophic failure from a sudden gust always the better goal? Where's the line between helpful protection and maybe too much coddling? Something to ponder the next time you're anchoring down a new plant in your garden.